All right, so now what we're going to do is kind of establish the basis of what was going on in a lot of the major Renaissance nations that we're going to discuss, that we're going to get into, and just kind of just hit them a little bit. Okay, so we're going to start here in France, and as this Renaissance is beginning, the Hundred Years' War is nearing its end. Now, early on, the English are going to have a lot of success, and by the time, if I jump down a little bit, by a guy by the name of Charles VII, as you see over here, quite a bit of land is controlled by the English. Okay, you have a good chunk down here, and then you have the area of Burgundy, which was containing Paris, of course, which has special significance, and what really has a lot of significance, the city of Reims, which was the ancestral area in which French kings would be crowned. Now, what's going to happen, though, is the Hundred Years' War is going to start the process of consolidating power in the hands of the king. Because the fact of the matter is coming out of feudalism, there are a lot of different lords that were kind of loyal to the king and some weren't. And then at one point, a lot of people weren't even sure who should even be the king. And that is going to change when Charles VII comes to power. Now, what Charles VII is going to do is establish a standing army and seize greater control over the resources of France and make his push against the English. He will be greatly aided, of course, and this was in some of the videos you already watched, of Jeanne d'Arc or Joan of Arc. We're not going to re-get into it here, but basically what long-term what Joan was able to do was to help turn the momentum against the English, particularly when she was able to take the city of Orleans or Orleans. Okay. Now she is captured outside of Paris, but that's okay. Not that's okay, but for the French, they would survive. Of course, sadly, the Joan was kind of sold out, and Charles, who owed in many ways his crown to her, made no attempt to get her back, and then of course she was tried for heresy and executed. But as far as Charles is concerned, it put him in a position to really consolidate holdings in France and really start the process of pushing the English out. And when the war was done, the guy that really started to get France into a position of success was Louis XI, better known as Louis the Spider. Great name there. So he was really, a lot of stuff to in his background. He's the son of Charles VII, and initially he rebelled against his dad because he thought his dad was doing a crappy job and wanted more power. His dad didn't let him have it, and so almost despite his father, at one point he is going to ally with the Burgundians, who were allied with the British. However, in the end, he will leave Burgundy after he gets power from his father and will be able to drive the English out. And as you can see, so this is the area that he'll take when he becomes the king, that he'll inherit after the English are put out, and then they're going to add Artois, Bourguignon, or Bourgogne. So, which I probably said wrong, but that's okay. So he is really going to be able to extend the power. What he did within France was really crucial, though. He is going to establish some taxation. Now, the reason why this is important, it is going to give the throne a steady income. And what that does is gives him greater overall power, as well as a power to keep up that army that his father has started. Economically, he's really going to start this thing called trade fairs, which if you look at the right here was a trade fair, which were kind of these informal areas that would pop up, some of which would eventually become cities, in which people could come to exchange goods. He realized that France needed a stronger central economy, which feudalism did not provide it, and that would also give him a greater tax base. And as we're going to see, the reignition of trade is what's going to be crucial into the Renaissance turning the fortunes of Europe around. He is also going to spend some time on improving the roadways within France, one, to move his army around more, but two, so these traders and merchants could move around as well. And he also started to make some moves against the nobles, okay? He would tax them. If they got a little bit too out of line, he would actually jail them. And it was really important that he did that because the problem of feudalism and the reason why nations were so weak is they didn't have strong central leadership, and Louis is going to change that in France. All right, so England, again, so we're going to go from war to some stability. Now, the 100 Years' War, they come out on the wrong side of that, and what ends up happening is that will have a lot of the big noble families kind of pointing fingers. They're angry at each other, and what will result is a long dynastic war that will go throughout most of the 50s, the 1450s, and then eventually again into the 1480s, and it would become known as the War of the Roses. It wasn't called the War of the Roses at the time. It got called the War of the Roses later. Some people attribute the title to Shakespeare, mainly because the major families, their main symbols were a rose. All right. So what you're going to end up having happen here is that the two main families you're going to fight this are the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Okay, it's a very Game of Thrones type moment if you think of it. And if you look at here, this map almost looks like the Game of Thrones map. And you can see here the Lancastrian victories and the Yorkist victories. The Yorks had a few more victories, and not surprisingly, in the end, or initially, the York family, and I guess I'm going to call it phase one, will be able to defeat the Lancastrians. Okay, so early on, York is victorious, and Edward IV becomes the king. And everything seems to be super great. Well, sadly, Edward dies very suddenly. Okay, and when he dies, his brother Richard III is named Lord Protector of England. Now, Edward had two sons, Edward V and his brother Richard. Yes, they're all the same names. We'll talk about what to do with all these names. So, Edward V and Richard, who actually had some title, he was a Duke of something, but they were both small. They were like 11 and 9. They were taken into custody to be protected by their uncle Richard, who is over there on the right. Okay, the left is the famous picture of the two princes in the tower. But shortly after the boys being taken into protective, air quotes, custody, Richard is able to get Edward's marriage, okay, ruled invalid. And thusly saying that the young boys were born out of wedlock, which means that they were not legitimate. Okay, we'll talk about this in class and the issues of legitimacy, but shortly after that ruling comes out, the boys disappear, and Richard III is named king. Now, the issue with this, guys, in all likelihood, he had the boys killed. There was a box found buried in the Tower of London that contained the skeletons of two small boys. Actually, Richard III's skeleton, we believe, we recently found digging in a parking lot. Go figure. But the fact of the matter is this is what people do to become kings. Either he did it or he had someone kill his nephews so he could become the king. This is what threw everything back into war. Everybody is, for the most part, appalled by what happened. And what you end up getting is that there were many Yorkists that refused to ally or to support Richard, and then they allied together with the remaining Lancastrians to try to overthrow Richard III. What they decided to do, though, is that they knew they really didn't have an heir that could I guess, really truly claim the throne, or that was strong enough. So what they did is that the Yorkists and Lancastrians, basically, they bury the hatchet between the two of them, the Yorkists that were against Richard III, and they supported Henry Tudor, who was the Duke of Richmond at the time, because they felt he was the best chance to actually overthrow the king. And you had a series of battles, which culminated with the Battle of Bosworth, in which Henry's forces were able to be victorious over Richard's forces, and Richard III himself was killed. In order to kind of smooth it over, Henry will then marry the daughter of Edward IV, the last king that was seen as legitimate, and that will kind of satisfy everybody, and now we have some peace. And he would become Henry VII. And Henry's going to do some things. Again, this time period is all about consolidating power, okay? He is going to eliminate all these feudal armies to have a large army in support of the king. Now, the thing is, he doesn't create a standing army, but what he does do is he allows certain nobles to have the right to raise forces for the crown. Now, this is a little bit different. Prior to this, in feudalism, nobles could raise their own money and raise their own armies. It didn't matter. Now you needed permission of the king to raise an army that was exclusively to be used for the crown, and that was only done to the most loyal of men. However, there were other nobles he did not trust, so he created something called the Court of the Star Chamber, which is over there on the right. It looks beautiful, but in the end, it's terrible. Basically, anyone that he felt could be a threat to him was accused of a crime. They would then be brought before the Court of the Star Chamber, typically tortured and forced to confess to something, to which summarily they would be executed. On the flip side, he did do some nice things, is that he actually spread taxation out. He didn't focus taxation on just the lower classes. He did move around so that no one group was taxed too much. And this is really important. And it wasn't like that the poor got taxed less and the rich got taxed more. It's not like it to be that way, but there's going to be noble taxes, middle class taxes, lower taxes. And what that does is it kind of made sure that the crown always had money coming into it. And what was really important, and we'll talk about this later, he will keep England out of a lot of nonsense wars that will go on the mainland. And by not fighting, you're able to increase your economic standing, and it's really going to help that when they do get involved in wars, they're going to be much stronger. And so Henry really is able to stabilize a lot of what was going on. In Spain, we basically have a run of unification in the 1400s, okay? By the 1450s, Spain was basically made up of, well, the Iberian Peninsula was made up of 5 countries, but you had 4 that were Spain. Navarre, Castile, Aragon, and Granada. Okay, Granada was controlled by the Muslims who invaded in the 700s. Navarre was its own, and Castile and Aragon, okay? Aragon, sorry. And what brought it all together was the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, a love story. It's very similar to Romeo and Juliet, except everybody didn't die, okay? This is really important, okay? Isabella was the heir to the throne of Castile. Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of Aragon, and they truly, and what we believe to be, they really loved each other. Their families, on the other hand, absolutely hated each other and forbade the marriage. The two didn't care. They eloped. They both got their thrones, and they were able to unite Castile and Aragon in the year 1469. Now, each kingdom would kind of run on its own, all right? So they still did independent things, and they basically just slowly but surely over time took away this little thing, took away that little thing, until about 1490, it really was just Spain at that point. What they will actually do is they will get rid of the nobles in government positions. Nobles, again, they have power, they like to hold power, and they can cause problems for the royalty. So what they're going to do is they're going to kind of get the nobles out of government positions and instead appoint lawyers and other highly trained professionals, in which you are going to get more effective governing done, because these people are going to be qualified. They will then develop a strong standing army, and finally they're going to cut a deal with the Pope, and they are very Catholic, and what they're going to do is everything they possibly can to expand Catholicism. What they do with the Pope is that they get the right to appoint bishops and other high-ranking clergy members. The reason why that is important is those guys in Spain had a lot of political power. So now they would all be under the auspices of the throne, while the Pope basically gets anything else he wants. It's a pretty big deal for their power. And then they're like, okay, it's time to reconquer all of Spain, okay? They're going to use their military against both Granada and Navarre. Now, Navarre was Spanish. The people would be conquered. They're a little bit different. They are the Basques. We'll talk about that later. But Granada was predominantly Muslim, and by 1492, they do conquer everything. But then they push forth this idea of extreme Catholicism and religious unity. Basically, if you weren't a Catholic, there was no room for you in Spain. They will persecute Muslims and Jews, and they will bring in the Inquisition into Spain. And the Spanish Inquisition was probably the most notorious of all of them. These people would be, basically, you were either forced to torture and convert, torture or die, or you would just get expelled. It was brutal no matter what. Now, in the long run, this is going to mess Spain up, and I'm going to explain that why later. But by 1492, Spain will be united under these rulers. They're going to have a strong economic base, and they're going to go on it's a short-lived run, but they're going to go on a run to forming one of the largest empires the world would ever see. Now, the Holy Roman Empire, this is a little bit of a different animal. The Holy Roman Empire, which interestingly enough is not necessarily Holy Roman nor an empire, but we'll get there. Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire, if you look right here in the middle, is basically a collection of all sorts of different states that had its foundations back under Charlemagne. But after Charlemagne's death, it broke up amongst his sons, and then you kind of had this crazy in and out. It's all going to really reach its height under the Habsburg family, who were Austrian, and what they did is through clever arranged marriages and getting inheritances, they are going to come to control most of modern-day Austria and a lot of the other provinces around it. A quote about them said, "Leave the waging of war to others, but you, happy Austria, marry, for the realms which Mars awards to others, Venus transfers to you." So let the other fools fight, and you get everything through marriage and treaty. It's kind of brilliant. Okay, they start out in Austria. They'll expand a little bit into Hungary. Hungary is its own kingdom. Eventually, they're going to get knocked off by the Holy Roman Empire. And then in the year 1440, a man by the name of Frederick II will be named the Holy Roman Empire. And from then, actually, believe it or not, all the way until 1917, some type of Habsburg is going to rule in this orange area. It's not always going to be the Holy Roman Empire. You're going to have Habsburgs in Spain. You're going to have them in Hungary and Austria, as well as down here. It's going to be an interesting way. Fun fact, though, Frederick II, high-end falconer, and brought falconry into a lot of popularity in Europe. I am not a falconer, but it's pretty cool. Now, here's going to be the issue long-term for the Habsburgs. In order to become an emperor, what happens in the Holy Roman Emperor is you have to be elected. There are 7 electors. They are the greatest of the nobles that have the most land. And they basically approve of whoever is going to officially be named emperor. So even though it's always going to be a member of the Habsburg family for the foreseeable future, they do have to kind of bribe these guys and keep them under control so that the Habsburg, and here's their sigil, and these are all the areas that they control. It's crazy. So the Habsburgs can remain in power, which means that the nobility will always have a certain level of power in the Holy Roman Empire, which means it will never really be 100% stable. But that's kind of where we're at for these nations. We're going to be talking about more, okay, don't get me wrong, but this is just to give you kind of a sense of where we're going, all right? So we'll talk about this more in class, and I'll see you guys soon.